Hi people, hope you're fine and you're doing well. Stay safe. Today we are going to look at the abolition of slave trade in East Africa by Mary Frances Zalwango at Trinity College, Nabingo. I hope you've already been taken through the reasons for the development of slave trade, the organization of slave trade, and the effects of slave trade. So today we are going to look at the reasons as to why slave trade was abolished in East Africa. One thing we should take note of is that the British spearheaded the abolition of slave trade in the world, and the following are the reasons why they had to abolish slave trade in East Africa. First and most important of all was the Industrial Revolution in Europe. With the Industrial Revolution in Europe, many machines replaced humans in industries, in farms, and so on. So this meant that the number of slaves being taken to Europe had to be reduced. So that is how the desire to end slave trade had to take off in East Africa. And then with the Industrial Revolution, there was need for the Africans to produce raw materials. So they thought that it would be better if they left the Africans, the slaves, in their places of origin, areas, countries of origin, to produce the raw materials that were to feed the industries back in Europe. And so there was need to end the slave trade. And then still, because of the Industrial Revolution, they realized that it was better they leave these people in their areas of origin, so that they should supply and provide market for the surplus goods that had increased as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And then social reforms in Britain. By this time in the 19th century, there were many reforms in Britain which called for equality of all races. So the British, taking themselves to be the lead, to take the lead to ensure that everybody was equal with the rest, they realized that it was not necessary to treat others as slaves. They had to reduce the master-slave gap. And so such reforms eventually influenced the British to end slave trade, first in Britain and in the British colonies, their spheres of influence, and then to the rest of the world. And that is how East Africa, that was mainly colonized by the British, had also to end slave trade. Then, in 1772, the Supreme Court of England, led by the Supreme Justice, Justice Lord Mansfield, declared slave trade illegal. After this judgment, in which Lord Mansfield declared that according to the law of England, there was anything that had to save and protect slave trade in England. So with such a judgment, there was no way slave trade would continue. And as it turned out, by this judgment, the British took it upon themselves first to end slave trade in British-controlled areas, and eventually influenced other areas to also end this trade. Then we also note that during the 19th century, there were many humanitarians who came up and campaigned the slave trade. These humanitarians, like William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, John Kirk, maintained that slave trade was an inhuman trade, and it was not fair. So these guys took it upon themselves to preach against this trade, and as it turned out, slave trade had to be stopped. Then also note that during the 19th century, many missionaries came around and preached against the trade as being ungodly. Going by the teachings of Christianity, it was not fair to treat others as slaves, which was not in line with the teachings of God. So by preaching against the trade as being ungodly, many of those who took up Christianity realized they had to end the trade. Then we also note that because of the increased exportation of slaves to Europe, eventually the population increased. And that is when they realized that it was no longer necessary to bring in more slaves from other areas, especially from Africa. And to reduce that population increase, which was not matching with the resources they had, they decided to stop slave trade in order to reduce the number. And then for the part of East Africa, the fact that slave trade had been abolished in West Africa, that meant also it had to be abolished in East Africa. Then back in Europe and wherever the slaves were, many of them were becoming rebellious. They were organizing strikes, they were organizing demonstrations against their masters, they were asking for more holidays, and this necessitated many of the people who had slaves to do away with them. And then with the increased industrial revolution in Europe, there was unemployment. So the guys there really believed that it would be better if they stopped the importation of labor in Europe and instead used their own people. So in order to solve the unemployment problem in Europe, they had to stop slave trade. And then the need to introduce legitimate trade in the world meant that they had to stop slave trade. Legitimate trade was the trade in legal acceptable trade items, and there was no way people could easily take on legitimate trade if slave trade was still ongoing. So the need to introduce legitimate trade necessitated the ending of slave trade. Then economists like Adam Smith criticized slave trade. They really realized that it was not economical to get labor from an unwilling labor, especially from Africa. You bring them, they work on your farms, whatever industries, when it was not out of themselves, when they were not motivated. So he realized that it was better to use the same people back in Europe to do the trade, as he realized that it was not economically viable to buy slaves, move them, then you bring them to Europe to work, even when they were not interested. So this such economists eventually influenced the ending of slave trade in the world. In conclusion, the reasons for the abolition of slave trade were mainly economic and humanitarian. I'll leave you that activity to explain the reasons for the abolition of slave trade in East Africa during the 19th century. Then we are going to look at the steps taken to abolish slave trade in East Africa. First of all, the steps taken did not start from East Africa per se, but started from out. But whatever was deliberated on from out eventually influenced the abolition of slave trade in East Africa. Like I said, in 1772, the Supreme Court of England, led by Lord Mansfield, declared slave trade illegal. And from then on, the British realized they had to end this trade. And that's why the British led the campaign to end slave trade. Then from 1787, many anti-slavery organizations formed by humanitarians were put in place. Anti-slavery organizations, anti-slavery committees, people who realized that this trade was not human, started coming up with organizations to preach, to campaign that trade. And many of those who were touched eventually realized that the trade had to end. Then in 1807, slave trade was made illegal in Britain and her colonies, that is the British Empire. The trade in human beings was declared illegal. And that's why now, for the case of East Africa, especially at the East African coast, the British took it upon themselves to ensure that the trade had to end. And in 1815, Britain stopped slave trade in Mauritius and the Seychelles Islands. These were British-controlled areas. So they stopped that trade in Mauritius and Seychelles Islands. And the fact that many of these, even many of the slaves taken to those islands were from East Africa, automatically this affected the source. And to ensure that no more slaves would be taken out of East Africa, they put patrol ships on the Indian Ocean. These patrol ships would ensure that they check every ship going out of the East African coast. And if they found any slave on board, that slave had to be taken back to East Africa. And if they found you with slaves on board, you also had to face court for that. So this meant that by putting patrol ships, this meant that the number of slaves moving out of East Africa started reducing. But then they also realized that there was need for them to come to an agreement with the people who were dealing in the slave trade per se. And that is why in 1882, Sir Fairfax Mosby signed a treaty with Saidi Saidi. Saidi Saidi was the leader at Zanzibar, one of the leading traders in human trade. So they signed a treaty in 1822. And in 1833, slavery was abolished in British controlled areas. So wherever the British were, it was decided slavery had to be abolished. Remember, the trade had earlier on been abolished. Now the idea of using someone's labor was also abolished. And in 1839, the Mosby Treaty was reinforced. By the Mosby Treaty, remember, it was agreed that Saidi Said was not to sell slaves to Christian countries. And in 1849, another agreement was signed between Hamilton and Saidi Saidi, in which they agreed still that Saidi Saidi had to reduce the level at which he was selling out slaves, especially from East Africa. And they realized that if they were to end slave trade, people should preach against that. So we see after 1850, many Christian missionaries were encouraged to come to the interior of East Africa to come and preach against this trade. And automatically, the many people who turned out to be Christians realized it was inhuman, it was ungodly, it was evil, and so they realized they had to end slave trade. Unfortunately, by 1850, around 1856, Saidi Saidi, who had signed many treaties with the British to end slave trade, died. And thereafter, the many treaties that were signed with the British were between the British and his sons. So we see that eventually another treaty was signed between Bagash, the son of Saidi Saidi, and Sabat of Raleigh. And in this treaty, it was agreed that Zanzibar, which was an international slave market, and other slave trade markets along the East African coast had to be closed. What this meant was that if the market where the trading is taking place is closed, that means that no more trading in that trade item would still continue. And as it turned out, with the closure of Zanzibar and other slave trade markets, the number of people going out of East Africa greatly reduced. And in 1884, Berlin Conference, if we go back to the time of the partitioning of Africa, the big powers convened in Bahrain under the guidance of Sir von Bismarck. And as it turned out, they were agreeing on how they were to divide Africa without going to war. But then they also had some provisions that for every European country interested in a particular area, in a particular country in Africa, they also had to ensure that as you take over that area, you also ensure that you stop slave trade. And as it turned out, for the case of East Africa, after 1884, still the British took it upon themselves to end the trade in East Africa. And in 1886, another treaty was signed between Karif. Karif was also a son of Saidi Saidi and the British, declaring freedom of slaves. So all those who were still being enslaved were declared free. And in 1888, slave trade was declared illegal in East Africa. Anybody found dealing in this trade in humans was supposed to face the law. Then in 1897, slavery was abolished in Zanzibar and Pemba. We note that much as the trade had seriously been declared illegal, slavery was still going on. So in 1897, slavery was abolished in Zanzibar and Pemba, especially due to the fact that many people had been enslaved on the clove plantations in Zanzibar and Pemba. And then as another way of ensuring that slave trade reduces legitimate trade, the trade in legal trade items was encouraged as an alternative to slave trade. So with many people taking on legitimate trade, the rate at which other people were engaged in slave trade greatly reduced. And then they also realized that slave trade was still going on because there was no transport. People were using slaves to transport their goods from the interior to the coast. So what they did was put in place roads and railway lines to ensure that people stop using slave transport and instead using this new infrastructure. And eventually in 1920, when after the First World War and the British took over Tanganyika as a mandated territory, they ensured that they stopped slavery and slave trade in the whole of East Africa. In conclusion, the steps taken to stop slave trade included signing of treaties, forming anti-slavery organizations, engaging many people, and putting alternatives to slave trade. I'm going to leave you with that activity to describe the steps taken by the British to abolish slave trade. Next time we shall be looking at the problems, the challenges that were faced as the British were trying to stop slave trade and the effects of the abolition of slave trade in East Africa. For more information, you can visit the link below. Bye. Have a good day. Meet again next time.